Lauren Sorkin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Resilient Cities Network. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Resilient Cities Network World Bank Cities on the Frontline Speaker Series. We're here with our 28th session this week, which is Risk and Crisis Communication. We have a fantastic female lineup tonight, and I'm so pleased that we're joined by two professionals from two very different parts of the world. Before I hand the screen and the microphone over to Francis to introduce them and a little bit more about our topic tonight, it is my duty, responsibility, pleasure to remind everyone of the ground rules and the reason that we come together in these sessions, and that is to support cities and the practitioners and partners that are working with cities to respond to COVID-19 with the knowledge that they need to help people and to save lives. So these are practitioner sessions. They are not on the record. However, they are open sessions. And so we ask that if there are members of the press on the line, or if you would like to take the participants' views or slides and publish them, that you reach out to us and we will connect you to the participants in order to clear that with them. And also, I'll remind everyone of our ground rules. Please use the Q&A button if you'd like to pose a question, and we will take questions from you on the line in the audience during the end of the panel session. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Francis Gasquer to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Lauren. As you said, I'm Francis Gasquer. I'm the practice manager for the Urban and Disaster Risk Management practice of the World Bank in East Asia. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the World Bank City Resilience Program and to introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker series will center around the topic of crisis communication and explore how cities have coped with the need to remain connected and inform their citizens during the COVID-19 crisis. We have two fascinating speakers indeed, as Lauren already pointed out. Olivia Jensen, she's a lead scientist at the Lloyd's Register Foundation Institute for the Public Understanding of Risk at the National University of Singapore. It's a very young institute, but focused on a very interesting and very relevant topic these days. And then we'll have Nadine Bourbar, who's the Deputy Chief Resilient Officer, Head of Local Economic Development at Ramallah Municipality in Palestine, and indeed a very, very different context than the one of Singapore. So we'll have very different perspective tonight. Rather than ex cathedra presentation, the session today will take the form of panel discussion. We've prepared questions to get us started, and then we'll pick up question from the audience to get the conversation going. And the presenters will have a couple of slides for this first question, just to establish and the context and set the stage. So I'll encourage you to ask your questions. About 300 people registered for the session today. So I encourage you to ask your question in the Q&A section of the WebEx. So without further ado, let me get started. Let me ask our first question to Olivia Jensen. So, Olivia, Singapore will certainly be credited with excellent communication during this COVID-19 crisis. For those living here in Singapore, Lauren and I are based here, and you're based here. We've seen the Prime Minister wearing a pink shirt and addressing the citizens with extremely clear and consistent messages. Can you share a bit of your views, your observation on risk communication in Singapore in general? What is the government approach to communication and public relations? Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Francis and Lauren and Yumi and the rest of the team. I only wish it wasn't 9 o'clock in the evening, which isn't my kind of peak energy time, but I will do my best to sort of participate as actively in the discussion as I can. I have a few slides, so let me zoom over to them, and I'll introduce, first of all, the shape of COVID in Singapore. this is what Singapore's COVID experience has looked like. This takes us right from before the first case in Singapore in January of this year, right through until today. Let me draw your attention to 4 aspects of this. First of all, overall, the rates of infection in Singapore have been extremely low. So the rate of prevalence is about 1%. There have been 27 deaths in the whole time period. So compared to the way that the virus has hit other places, overall the prevalence, the spread of the virus here has been very low. Let me explain about the distinction between the different colors on the chart. Now, Singapore reports on the different cases, dividing them into 3 different categories. Imported cases, so the cases where people were infected abroad. What are called community cases, which are residents of Singapore who catch the virus within Singapore. And then they distinguish a dormitory resident. Now, this is a specific local category of people, about more than 300,000, mainly men, mainly people working in the construction industry, who live in dormitories at those premises which are organized by their employers. And these are tend to be quite densely packed. In the past, there have been 12 to 20 people living together in a single room. And what you can see is that almost all of the cases in Singapore have been amongst this group. And the virus took off and spread within this group when Singapore had already moved into its lockdown, which it refers to as a circuit breaker. Third thing to note from this chart is about the data itself. So this comes from the Ministry of Health. And right from the very first day of a case in Singapore, the Ministry of Health was reporting on its website about individual cases, including which street people lived on, where their place of work was, their age, their gender. And it was also collating the statistics. And it made these readily available to everyone. That meant that at any time during the crisis, if you wanted to know exactly how many new cases there were, what kinds of cases there were, and where those people had been who had been diagnosed as having COVID, you could find that information right from the start. Detailed, consistent, and very accessible data. Let's have a look at some of the messages. These are messages, communications by the Prime Minister that were made at key moments during the COVID crisis. One is so from the 8th of February, before anything really happened in Singapore. They would have raised the alert level, or signaled that they would have raised the alert level, and this triggered some panic buying in the supermarkets. So one of the first communications that the Prime Minister was engaged in himself was to tell people not to panic. There's no need to panic. The second communication there, looking at the trend, that's the announcement that the Prime Minister made when he was announcing that Singapore was going to go into lockdown, circuit breaker, 4 days later. Let me draw your attention to his reference to the whole of government approach that Singapore took to communication. I discussed this with a multi-ministry task force, and we have decided that instead of tightening incrementally over the next few weeks, we should make a decisive move now. The third communication was made as the lockdown was lifted. And this has some very typical elements of the Singaporean strategy to communicating about the risk. Dealing with COVID is a marathon, not a sprint. Even when there's a vaccine, everything will not simply go back to the way it was before. So let me draw out 2 kind of key themes or 2 aspects to the communication in Singapore. One is what we might call defensive pessimism. And this was actually a kind of an approach to communicating in a crisis that was developed during the SARS epidemic more than 10 years ago, almost 20 years ago now. And that was to communicate from the outset the seriousness of the crisis and the government's role as thinking about the worst case scenario and planning for that. The second kind of theme, and I think we see this in the there's no need to panic kind of narrative, is almost a maternal, caring approach in the messages that have come out of government here. And that's essentially, we'll take care of you. Don't worry. We've got things under control. There's enough food. There are enough masks. We are testing. And that message, it seems, has been extremely effective. I've got one quote here from somebody responding, replying to the Prime Minister's comments on his Facebook page, saying, many of us can feel comfortable and at peace during this time of crisis because we know that you and your team are there for us. So the idea that you actually yourself don't need to worry about the COVID crisis because you know that the government is doing that worrying and that preparation for you. On a lighter note, I wanted to point out that when the Prime Minister makes important speeches, he wears pink shirts, but you already stole that joke from him. But it's true that throughout this period, he wears the pink shirt. I'm not sure what the meaning of that is, so we'll look into it further. Let me just draw your attention to another aspect of the communication here, and this is the communication surrounding enforcement. These communications don't come directly from the government, but there are information supplied to the government that's then carried in the local newspapers, including the biggest and most mainstream newspapers. These are three examples, and these ones are recent. So these are after the main brunt of the crisis had already passed. An arrest warrant issued for a teen who took part in an unlawful gathering, a man who removed his mask and coughed at supermarket staff, or 12 people who back in August went to the beach as a group of friends, not wearing masks, posted about it on social media, and now find themselves charged with breaching the social distancing regulations. So another theme, alongside defensive pessimism and this sort of maternal caring thing, is also the seriousness of enforcement. We wanted also to take a look then at the reaction to this. And we've done this mainly by looking at Twitter data. Okay, there are lots of drawbacks from using Twitter data, but you can't take a survey every day. And the only way for us to get a feeling of, in this very fast-moving context of communications in a crisis, to get a feeling for how people are reacting and which stories they're picking up, is to look at something like Twitter. What we did was to identify Singapore-linked Twitter accounts, about 2 million of them, and then we look within those for those with the keywords COVID-19 or coronavirus, and then we look at the words that are coincident with those, and I'll come on to that in the next couple of slides. But this gives you an idea just of the whole picture of how people were talking about COVID in Singapore on Twitter. And you can see that so much of the activity was focused in that very early period, before the lockdown occurred. So especially, and even in the period when there were almost no, like 2 or 3 or 4 cases in Singapore. So it was that period, the initial period of great uncertainty when the crisis was growing in China and then in Italy, but it hadn't really hit Singapore, that there was most activity about it. And the most activity on any single day was when the Prime Minister made his address saying that this was a crisis of the utmost seriousness. That was before they'd signaled policy moves to, for example, serious policy moves and to going into lockdown. By the time we hit the circuit breaker period itself, in many ways, the interest in the activity has died off, or very considerably. And you can see that by the time we get to into June through to September, well, there are lots of other things on people's minds, including in Singapore, the national elections. We also looked at other things which we thought might kind of be correlated with higher levels of activity on Twitter. The budget announcements, Singapore has announced some very important schemes to support individual employees and firms. Ministers' pay cut announcements. So the ministers announced that they would take 3 months without salary. Mask distribution. That was an important issue where people were and still are concerned about getting access to masks. And we don't see peaks of activity on any of these days. What we really see, I think, is this activity around uncertainty at the beginning of the COVID period. One thing we did in terms of these sort of correlations was to try to look at some words with particularly emotional content. And it's quite tricky to work out which words really signal emotional content. We went with the words you can see on your screen in terms of positive affect, like angel, hero, solidarity. On the negative side, disgusting, shameful, shocking, and then including a whole bunch of sort of Singaporean Singlish colloquialisms and English colloquialisms and swear words. What I think this shows us is that despite a lot of focus on spreading negativity through social media, that at least in Singapore and in this period, the balance has been very positive. There are perhaps 2 sort of positive tweets for every negative tweet. And that this was true when the crisis was evolving very fast around the March period. And a lot of that positivity was directed towards health workers and gratefulness to health workers. But it's actually sustained much further across the months than the negative, the words with a negative valence. Finally, I want to talk very briefly about truth. And another thing that we often think about in social media is a serious concern with fake news and the viral spread of lies and of stories which have no basis in fact. And one of the challenges for governments is to try to counter these and try to manage them. So we looked at the frequency of words which we say are related to truth claims. So we're not actually looking at whether what's in the tweet is true. We're looking about whether the person is talking about truth or not. And so that includes sort of truth, lies, fake news, Ideally, I think, from the point of view of a government communicator, there would be as few of these claims about truth as possible. We don't want the debate to be about, and the activity in social media to be about what's true and what's not. We want it to be about people spreading information in which they have confidence and not worrying and thinking about whether the different sources of information that they're drawing on are telling them the truth or not. And I think what we see in this chart then is it signals some degree of success on the part of the Singapore government. That inevitably in that early period between the end of January and April, there were a lot of tweets with these truth claims, but they died off. As the crisis itself came under control, as the science became more clear, and as the messaging from government about appropriate action became more clear, they died off. Another thing that's interesting and very relevant in Singapore is Singapore's legislation known as POFMA about online falsehoods. And this has been used quite extensively over the last year in relation to social media activity about COVID. In fact, half of the cases brought under this legislation have been about COVID. But I'm going to stop there And Francis and Lauren, you've lived through the Singapore COVID experience as well. So please feel free to give a reality check and how the experience has been for you. And I look forward to perhaps talking a little bit more in a minute about, well, what can we take from the Singapore example? Is Singapore just too special in terms of the trust that citizens have in government to be very relevant outside? And I'll turn it back to you then, Francis, and look forward to hearing more about Ramallah as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Olivia. Fascinating account of the experience in Singapore. We're now going to Ramallah. I think it'd be hard to find a city that's further in context than Ramallah from Singapore. And Nadine, just basically asking you then your reflection on the COVID-19 challenge in Ramallah and how the city has engaged with citizens to ensure that they get the credible information they need, and how did Ramallah decide what's the best way to interact, and what have you learned from that experience? Also, maybe and specifically for Ramallah, how has the city reached out to vulnerable communities around its territory? Over to you.
And good morning, good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here, and not only as a participant in all this series, but now as a speaker on such an important and interesting topic for me. It was actually really interesting to listen to Olivia and to see the similarity between what our government has done and what Singapore government has been doing. But now I will take you on a deeper level, on a local level, city level measures and risk and crisis communication, and how the city of Ramallah, given the major political challenges it was facing, what were our reaction and how we were able to pull off an effective communication with the community. So just a bit of a snapshot about what is Ramallah for who does not know what Ramallah context is. So Ramallah is a Palestinian city located in the West Bank. It has received 2 waves of displaced Palestinians in the beginning and mid of the 19th. And in late 90s, it became the seat for the headquarters of a Palestinian National Authority, which made it a center for economic, cultural, and a service center in Palestine. This did not come with benefits only, but also with major urban challenges pressing on the city's fabric. And then in 2014, we became members of now called the Global Resilient Cities Network, and we dreamed together to make a resilient Ramallah more real. And today, as all cities across the globe, we're facing the outfall of the COVID pandemic. So these challenges would be summed up in terms of the lack of control over land and borders that Palestine and of course Ramallah faces, because we know at the beginning of the outbreak, all the city's first response was to shut down their borders, their airports, and to get control over the transient population. But that was not the case for us. The second challenge that was very pressing, which is the financial challenges, not just because political unrest can affect the financial ability and the economy, but also the Palestinian economy is made of SMEs, and they were the most hit by this pandemic. And third of all is the lack of information, especially at the beginning. People were going into outrage about lack of information, what to do. The whole idea of a lockdown was not really viable since people were very much in need of their economic life. So what we had to do as a city, being on the forefront with the people, we needed to come with good communication and with well-informed measures to handle this. First of all, we needed to talk to ourselves, within ourselves, to get the consensus internally about what to do and how to react instantly. We assigned an emergency team, and we had the drill very clear about what we need to do. And once we got that internal consensus, within us, we then had to move to the external stakeholders, which are citizens. We needed to make sure that everyone is connecting, everyone is getting access to information, everyone has the space to engage, to speak, and to be understood. We instantly used our GIS system in order to zone the city into 19 neighborhoods to facilitate better services, to analyze all the interactions happening in the city, the incoming complaints, demands, and communication, and do a spatial analysis about these transactions to inform our decision making. Because we were in a situation where we did not have enough information about this virus, we had different resources at the beginning, giving different facts, and the people were being misled sometimes into this misinformation. We had conducted many social media awareness campaigns, which has aimed to instill control, familiarity, and to give more facts than fear for our audience, for citizens. It was basically to exchange knowledge, to exchange information, and to exchange concern with the public, to make them feel that they are understood. And what was really important is the language that we have used with citizens. We went more towards storytelling, telling them, reminding them why they love this city, why they love Ramallah, why the city gives and is there for them. And we needed also to instill that this situation needs everyone's effort, that we're going to get out of this together. And this is the language that was used all the way in our communication with the people over social media or even through personal contact. What also we had to do, which was really important, to give people the right to get access to credible information sources, is that we needed to be an effective part of this ecosystem. We needed to partner with the stakeholders who were responsible of delivering healthcare information that was derived from the WHO instruction and the Ministries of Health instruction. And we tried to get this information and make it available to the people, even on our platform, so that people can can get exposed to all these credible sources of information, and this way we can overcome this misleading information coming out in the media. So that was not just what we think was critical. Social media was a way to make people feel that they're safe, but at the same time, we needed them to feel that their engagement in the community life was not compromised, even when they are in lockdown. So what we did is that we tried to target each target group from each age and to make a specific activity for this target group, targeting seniors, kids, celebrating major days, such as Jazz Day, Land Day, which were very important, and people were always used to having celebrations in the city for these events, and we needed to make sure that even in critical times, they will still enjoy this right to celebrate these days. Our communication was also to tell people that responding to this crisis and the recovery of this crisis will need us to be hand in hand, and that change should come from them as well. We have announced an online call to ask people what do they think the solution should be, and what do they aspire out of this recovery. And we collected some data and we made them feel heard. So I would like just to give one example, quick example of what happened. So we decided to respond to the people's need to do family activities even during lockdown. So we arranged a Ramallah Spring Day event to be not in the city how we usually do it on a yearly basis. We ask people to come to the city and to plant in a designated area of the city. But this year we told them as an initiative that we will bring the plants to their homes so that they can plant it at their homes. So we made them feel that this this activity comes to them as a request from us to them that the change should be hand in hand. So what happened in the next 2 or 3 days? We started receiving pictures from citizens who decided to take the initiative to agree to go out to their neighborhoods and to clean the streets as a voluntary work. So here we felt that this resilience building did not only mean that we were making sure that people are being involved in community life, but we are also building trust between us and between citizens. So I guess what we have learned from this engagement with citizens is that communication can help and encourage citizens move from being only service recipients, but be active participants in the solution and change. And that as much as we could be inclusive in our communication and our engagement, we are able to maintain the resources that we have during critical times. And that communication has helped us not only to build resilience, but also to build the trust. So with that, I would leave it back to you, Francis, and looking forward to the upcoming discussion.
I think that Lauren is going to take over for the second round of questions. Over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Francis. Happy to. I mean, thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Nadine, for such informative presentations and also inspiring in a lot of ways, really breaking down how 2 very different cities have been communicating, inspiring trust, making people feel taken care of. I'm going to circle back now to you, Olivia, to talk about your observations from Singapore and what can really be learned. What are these key takeaways in terms of risk communication that are important for other cities to be aware of? And can you break it down for us and share some practical recommendations that other cities can implement?
A few thoughts. But first, I love the story about the plant distribution. I can see how that could absolutely be the perfect thing in a time of COVID. A few thoughts then from Singapore. I hope they don't sound trite. Maybe they're too obvious, but maybe they're good to think about anyway, and why we don't always fail to kind of follow these rules of thumb. I think the first one is be prepared. Singapore had a chance to be prepared because it went through the SARS experience in 2003. And during that time, they developed both their sort of approach, their philosophy of communicating in the crisis. They also developed some of the mechanisms of it. And so in a way, Singapore was already kind of running when the crisis hit. For places that elsewhere in the world, of course, hadn't had that experience before, it was they needed to suddenly kind of grasp experience from elsewhere and try to put it together into a package. So I guess first would be prepared. And then in terms of kind of crisis communication, and this could apply across so many different areas, but I guess be fast, be credible. And what we see with misinformation is that it explodes whenever there's a gap in the official communication. So it's when people feel that they're not getting all the details that they fill it in with whatever they can find, and they're grasping for. So people are really thirsty at that stage in a crisis. And I think however difficult it is, and however much you feel, maybe the scientists advising the government feel, well, things are too uncertain, we shouldn't communicate about this quite yet. That's probably not the right approach. The right approach is to, while acknowledging uncertainty, is to make sure that you're communicating something helpful. And signaling, if you don't know yet, when that information is going to come. So we don't know this yet, but Thursday will tell you, whatever it is. A third thing, and I think this is an amazing aspect of Singapore's approach, but in part due to Singapore's governance structure itself, is that it approaches this as a whole of government. And that's much easier in a country with, a unitary system, a single layer of government, than it is in a federal system or a decentralized system. And yet, surely we should be aiming for that. However however challenging the governance structure is. The different elements within the government have got to speak with the same voice. And as soon as there is a sense that there is a gap or a difference in approach between different bits of the government, again, social media and all the kinds of fake news and other sources of information that we worry about sort of filling in the gap will do so. So having a clear government line, and Singapore I think does this, has done this during COVID extremely well. The Prime Minister makes important announcements, and then he says, and the Minister for Trade and Industry is going to fill you in on this, or the Minister of Health is going to fill you in on the details, and then those details on the particular aspects of the response are taken over by the ministers. So I think those three things, sort of rules of thumb, are probably applicable wherever you are, and probably applicable across different types of crises as well.
Thank you, Olivia. So we've got to be prepared, and then we've got to over-communicate, keep filling in those blanks, and be coordinated as well, no matter where we are. I think very good and applicable messages for cities out there. Nadine, you shared some really practical measures that Ramallah has taken. Jazz days, challenges. What kinds of future directions will Ramallah take trying to balance this need to maintain civic engagement and really ensure proper risk communication around COVID-19, which seems to be staying with us longer than any of us may have expected?
Yes, indeed. That's the only fact that we know for sure, that this is not going to be going away anytime soon. So what we have learned from the past months is that we really need to be inclusive in our planning. And just 2 months ago, we started planning into developing our own inclusive policy, city inclusion policy. And that's to react on all the endeavors that happened through the past months, and of course, previously during our planning for our projects, the resilience strategy and all that. But we feel like now we need to be more focusing on how to build better partnerships, how to be effective in our engagement with the community, and we need to do that by involving everyone. We need to facilitate citizens' effective involvement because that is going to inform our urban governance process and how to become a resilient city. I think with the context that COVID has left us with, as a city, we need to be putting in more and stronger digital infrastructure, and at the same time we need to balance between this digitization and analog. We should not lose this human touch, human interaction with citizens, but at the same time we should assure them of this digital infrastructure that they would need to bounce back against this pandemic. We should not forget that there are still vulnerable or people living in underprivileged situations. So while we do that, while we transform into digital services, we should make sure that we are educating and empowering those who are living in underprivileged situations, and that we need to take this step by step by them and make sure that they are following up and that we're not really missing or leaving anyone behind while we do this, because the growth in technology can be too fast that we sometimes can overlook certain group of people, and that's what we should not be doing. And maybe one example that I would give about the digitization is that we now are partnering with the private sector, for example, in order to help people to be able to access e-cash, e-payments, and to get access to a more modern and digitized services through the municipality. Yeah.
So I want to follow up on that, Nadine, because you actually brought back a topic that we touched on some weeks ago when we talked about digitization. We talked about the digital divide and what risks there are as we, bounce forward and spend more of our lives online. And so, practically speaking, how do we ensure that we're getting to these vulnerable communities. And Olivia, if you also have insights on this, I mean, how do we balance the kind of new and fast-moving communication with getting communication information consistently to those folks who might not have, a device in hand 8 or 10 hours a day?
I guess for us, sometimes we do engage them through our cultural and social activities because we know that they will not be always there online connected or with high internet bandwidth. We know that for sure, especially for Palestine, because it's a country situation, the bandwidth. But we know that there are people who have better access to internet than others. So we try to target them through, for example, if we're talking about kids who don't have sufficient access to internet, we go target them through the school. We engage schools in our activities. So this way we make sure that all students at all ages are engaged in our activities and are informed what the city does and how they can be part of this.
There's definitely an echo with Singapore there, where sort of alongside the activities on social media, there are also these sort of community events which happen very regularly, in which community representatives try to pass on information. So that's there's definitely an echo there. In Singapore, the inclusion and exclusion is also related to age, but mainly to do with old people. So the elderly would, in Singapore, tend to be the least connected. And the government has engaged in quite active campaigns to get old people sort of familiar and comfortable with these technologies. They have representatives, sort of volunteers who go out into the community, sort of tech helpers, sort of often young people working in those domains who go out to visit the elderly in social housing blocks and try to sort of talk through their problems with them and so on. So that's sort of one more aspect. And then a third aspect is all the communication that goes on through traditional media. And I'm guessing this is the same in Ramallah as well, that we haven't forgotten about traditional media. And in Singapore, there's this very sort of close working relationship between the newspapers and the government. And there are also several languages in which things need to be communicated. So there are English language papers, but there are also Chinese papers. And when the Prime Minister makes his speeches, he speaks in first in English, and then in Mandarin, and then in Malay. So to make sure, again, to try to reach the different communities in their most comfortable language.
Yeah, I'm only giggling, Nadine, because in Singapore, and Olivia and Francis will know this, there's a joke because when the Prime Minister gives his speeches, after he finishes in English, he takes a sip of tea, y entonces se habla en otro idioma. It's like he starts speaking in the other language right after he takes a sip of tea. So there's this common joke that it is a magic drink, exactly. So that's why I was laughing. But over to you, Francis, for our next question.
I want to build on this discussion. One thing that strikes me is maybe one fundamental element of communication, particularly in crisis, is remembering that we talk to people, right? And people have emotions, people get tired, people, they suffer in time of crisis, and it's probably fundamental not to forget that. There's a very good question from Sumit Argawal, who asks, in this context, and probably for you first, Olivia, and maybe for your comments as well, Nadine, will be interesting. But how do you keep communicating in the distance? How do you keep people engaged? How do you make sure that people, don't at one point just give up and do whatever, they just shut down because it's going to be all the same? How do you do to have them continue to follow precaution measures so that society as a whole continue to be safe?
Yeah, there's no doubt about the fact that people get information and communication fatigue. And governments aren't just communicating about COVID, right? They're still continuing with all their other campaigns about healthy eating and cycling to work and all the other things that the government wants us to do. I think ideally, your campaign would be effective enough that these things become habits and that you change the expectation about how people are meant to behave. So if we're thinking about the link between, let's say, mask wearing and social distancing and communication, ideally, you would make those arguments successfully enough in the initial stages of a crisis and consistently enough that people then adopt that habit and you don't have to keep communicating about it with the same intensity. I think you could say that's true. That's been relatively successful in Singapore. The assumption now is that people will wear their masks unless, rather than the other way around. I think if you're still trying to, months into a crisis, you're still trying to convince people of the benefits or the reasons behind wearing a mask, there may be deeper communication issues. There may be deeper reasons why people are not engaging it other than the fact that you're not reaching your desired audience or you're not using the right kind of narrative. Very challenging.
We have a
online. Go ahead, Lauren.
We have a question which is, I should say, very near and dear to my heart because it's about my home country. And the question is quite direct, coming from Maha Isa. And I think we're all fairly familiar with what's going on in the U.S. And what the question is really about is, how you can learn from mixed messages and responses. What can you do when you haven't necessarily taken the right steps in the beginning? How do you recover from that? Olivia, I don't know if you have advice on that kind of situation.
Yeah, after all I just said about, being first and being right and being credible, it's I've got to say what to do when you've gone wrong, but absolutely. And, actually there is one element of the Singapore communications experience with regard to COVID, which speaks to this, which is about masks. Because in the first few weeks of the pandemic, when the number of community cases was small but growing, the government advised against wearing masks. And the reason for that was that the scientific advice was that they weren't terribly effective in preventing infection, and there was a concern about the availability of masks for health workers for whom it was a priority. So they said, don't wear it, and if you've got symptoms, don't wear a mask. Of course, the scientific advice changed. And Singapore accompanied that with a campaign to distribute masks to everyone for free. So there was actually a sort of dual communication with, in social media, people saying, masks have run out, where can I get a mask? The government saying no need to wear a mask, and the government saying, and we're going to distribute masks. So I guess they resolved that by, as soon as the scientific evidence did become clearer, and it was also became evident that there wasn't going to be a shortage of masks themselves, of saying the scientific evidence has become clear. We're now in a position to say that the right thing to do is to wear a mask. So in a way, it was a very honest approach to trying to clear up that initial, what we know now in retrospect, although it was a perfectly sound scientific, based on sound scientific advice at the time, what we know now in retrospect was not the right advice. So admitting that there was, new information becomes available in an evolving crisis, and that we now know better. And I guess because it was consonant with what people felt anyway, it didn't create a big sort of upset in people's approach to mask wearing. I think honesty and revealing information as soon as one can from the part of the government agency or another communicating agency, the feeling to be able to convey to people that you haven't been holding any information back but you've got new information, and that now leads to different advice. I think is probably the best general message that we can, the best general learning that we can take from this experience.
Thank you, Olivia. I have a question for you, Nadine, and it's a slightly different change of topic, but you've talked a lot about the love of the city and how you've tried to continue community life and togetherness. And I think that's probably been particularly important and useful in Ramallah, given the context of Ramallah being really, in a way, the center of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Do you feel that there's been lessons learned from this experience, that things that you've done over the last 6 months that you're going to be able to carry out, and that's going to make Ramallah a stronger city and more of a cohesive or a stronger community for the future?
Yes, this crisis has tested our love for the city and the citizens' love to this city. I guess what we consider as a prominent aspect of our resiliency as a city is our culture, and we build our resilience through culture. So I guess it has been tested that as much as we get people to feel that they belong to this place, that they have a voice, and that we are providing them with the platforms to share their thoughts, their initiatives, their skills, and to feel that they can anytime reach to the municipality and be heard and to action their ideas. I guess that's what we will build on, because citizens at the end, they need to belong to the place where they are, whether what name it is. It's what they feel, it's the empathy that they feel from the surrounding environment and the language that it's being spoken there. So we would continue definitely with promoting such cohesiveness between people, and as much as we can to try to get their initiative coming into the municipality, and we will try to action these initiatives.
And maybe if we turn back to you, Olivia, do you think that the crisis and the way the government has managed the crisis, do you think it will impact Singapore in the long run? I think that this crisis economically will change the city, but what about communication-wise, the relation between the government and the citizens?
I'm not sure. I think it'd be great to hear to your views, other Singapore residents, on this as well. My feeling is not so much. My feeling is that in terms of the communication, both outwardly and the way that people have responded to it, has been fairly consistent with what's gone on before. And that in terms of, there hasn't been a great challenge to the way in which government interacts with citizens during this period. It's strengthened some things, it's amplified some things. It's been a setting in which these government regulations on online falsehoods, for example, has begun to play out. But those are many things that were already in train before the crisis began, and will continue to sort of develop once this COVID crisis is over. But maybe there are other aspects to it. I don't know what you think.
It's difficult for me to answer that question. I'll pass it to Lauren. I think it's a difficult question. I think that it really has shown the value of having a cohesive government and to have clear leadership. And of course, it's easier in Singapore because you're not dealing with different layers of government. You don't have a national government, a federal government, provincial government, municipal government. But it's also a government that is extremely well organized to start with. So I still think that the government has managed to create a special relationship, whether it wasn't there before or it's more now, or whether I'm curious to see how it's going to evolve and whether some policies are going to change. Not just about the government be more confident, but also about the government listening to the needs of the citizens in a slightly different ways. So we'll see. The future will tell.
Yeah. I suppose I would build on that. It's been a very interesting time, I think, to be living in Singapore. Clearly, there are a lot of enabling factors in the communication space here and in the success in confronting COVID-19. And some of that, Francis, you already articulated so well. I mean, it's a very coordinated, cohesive, and flat structure. And, you know, there's also a very high level of social cohesion and trust in government. I do think, because we're talking about communications tonight, that it's increased the volume of communications about public issues and about how people take care of each other in Singapore. And so I think we've seen an increase of those types of communication and social media. And so that may spill into more and more of the debate, because I've been involved in a lot of conversations about Singapore, and the blend, Olivia, you showed it so beautifully on your graph, between, you know, the social media activity around COVID-19 and then leading into the election. It was a dovetail, really. And so we've seen that in a lot of places, not just in Singapore, where there are elections coming up and COVID-19 plays into that. And so I think it changes the tone of the narrative and forces people to talk about, you know, economics, politics, and social issues so seamlessly that I think it results in a much healthier debate about the kinds of societies that we really want to live in. So I know we're coming close to time here. I would open it up to Olivia and Nadine. If you have any final comments and thoughts you want to share in, say, a minute or less, thoughts you want to leave this audience with before we wrap it up, I'll open it for you. Can I come to you first, Nadine?
So what I would like to take out of all this discussion is that what I meant by inclusive and inclusion is that thinking forward from this point, that we need to be more realistic now when we think of the recovery, while we put our goals and indicators for the future. We don't want more global lists getting taller and taller. We want more goals to be achieved. And that would need us to think to think together in a very comprehensive way, but at the same time in a very realistic way, because I guess everyone in this world has been affected emotionally or physically from this pandemic, and we need a lot to bounce back and come back stronger.
Olivia, any final thoughts?
Yeah, that was a lovely and very encompassing comment from Nadine. I was going to say something much more kind of practical and down to earth about how we should set up, you know, data systems so that people could access stuff. But I think I prefer the idea that, so echoing both Nadine's comments and yours, Lawrence, that we allow this to help us to talk about the interconnectedness of issues. And to think hard and to think about how we communicate to those who've suffered the most, how we reach them, and how we communicate in particular to them. That we don't lose sight of that in the feeling that this is a great global crisis or a great national crisis, but that it touches individuals very differently, and how do we recognize that in the way that we communicate about it?
Thank you both for such meaningful contributions throughout tonight's panel, and thank you to all of the attendees for the excellent questions. We tried to get to all of them, and I do want to say again, thank you to everyone for being here, and you do not want to miss next week's session. It is about funding and financing recovery, and we have 4 speakers who are going to be coming to us in a very interactive panel. They are Roland White, who leads the World Bank's Global Municipal Finance Practice, Kamal Kishore from the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure in India, Priscilla Negreiros, who's the project manager of the city's Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, and the Deputy Mayor of Finance for Thessaloniki in Greece. So please do sign up early, share the invitation with friends, and until we meet again, be safe, be healthy, and be well. Good night, everyone from Singapore.